Hey everyone, this is Uri Peleg for Guerrilla Poker. In this video I'm going to be going over the largest amount of big blinds I won in a single hand from the last year. I'm going to dive in pretty deep, hope you guys enjoy it and manage to take some stuff away from it. The hand was played on a rat hole table on WPN. Rat hole tables work where you buy in with 10 big blinds, but there's no rat holing. That means if you won a lot, next session you're coming in with the same stack you left with, so stacks can sometimes get pretty big. Let's dive into the action. Rocket Scientist goes all in for 13 big blinds. I call, which is the only play you should be making here. There's no point in re-raising. And we get this 4-bet, good time to practice your poker face. This kind of spot is something I refer to as a Wild West spot in poker. What do I mean by Wild West spot? I mean that nobody knows what they're doing and nobody knows what anyone else is doing. And for these reasons, these are the kind of situations in which you'll see people making the largest mistakes and where there's a lot of room to outmaneuver people if you understand the spot better. I think the first thing I was thinking is that his range should be very tight. Much tighter than a cold 4-bet situation, where this to go raise 3-bet and he called 4 bets. When we both fold, he wins the entire pot. Here, if I fold, he still has to raise Rocket Scientist with his equity, so I assumed this would have to be tighter than a cold 4-bet range, which is already very tight. So first thing I want to do with you guys is to test this assumption. To do this, I made these 4 lines in Excel. The first is a simulation of his EV were it to go raise to 3 big blinds, 3-bet to 13, 14, 4-bet to 48. And here he would need to succeed roughly 75% of the time to start earning a profit. Now I made a slightly different calculation where here he's going to win his equity share times the side pot of 39.5 with the 3 of us all in. And then there's a new variable of equity. How much equity does he need versus the other guy's range? And the answer is he needs quite a lot of equity to get to a similar point. So were he to have the same success against me, he'd need 77% equity against the other player's range, which is an insane amount. Just to kind of show this to you guys, I put out a shoving range for the under the gun player. I took out the top range hands and it's a bit too loose, but most people play the spot a bit too loose. And here we can click on hand range calculator and say, well, what hands have 77% equity against this range? And the answer is kings plus. If it were to just play like this, where I play 5-bet or fold, he would have to be extremely tight. I feel like we're getting close to an inflection point where if I'm shoving, I can only shove aces and then he has to fold everything. But if his range is aces and kings, you know, so kind of these weird spots in poker when you're deep and ranges get really tight and really crazy things happen. Now, I want to look a little bit deeper at that and talk a bit about ranges and see how correct that actually is. If we go look at Equilab and assume something like this is my calling range, we can talk about what strategy I would play. So if I think he's being super tight, I think there are 2 reasonable strategies for me to play, and this is where you get to see kind of me building an equilibrium by hand. One strategy for me to play would be, well, if your range is so tight, I'm just going to shove kings and aces, or ace king and aces, or, you know, ace deuce and aces, whatever we decide makes the most sense. Have to remember it's also a protected pot. I think shoving kings and aces, even though it doesn't work well if he's just having kings and aces, is a response that some people might make. How often would he get to squeeze here if I were just shoving kings and aces and folding everything else? So this is the formula I put here, and then the variables are his raise size, his equity against the calling range, the pot size he's gonna win, how often I fold, and how much money he gets back from his raise size. If I were going with kings plus, with the shoving range I put out, that would be 83% folding. And that would mean he would need 60% equity to win $8 on the shove, with the rakes usually capped at $5, so we're talking roughly 59% equity. Again, this is something we can look at in Equilab. So were I to play the simple strategy of just shoving kings plus, he could go with tens plus ace king actually, which is a lot wider than just kings and aces. That's because in this situation I wouldn't be like we calculated before, folding 75% of the time. I'd be folding 83% of the time, and these things make a big difference. Alternate strategy for me would be to play call only here, not shove, because ranges are so tight. I think that's pretty reasonable. Calculating that's a lot more complicated. I did do that here with some assumptions, and again the formulas here. You could look at various flatting strategies. For me, I think a reasonable one would be calling something like this, queens plus ace king suited. Again, you have to remember, I'm assuming his range is really tight. With me calling and not shoving, obviously I'd be folding less of the time, but he actually got to get away with a much lower equity share. So if, for example, I were going with ace king suited, kings and aces as a call, and everything else folds, that would be 16 combos out of 72. So we're talking somewhere around this amount of folds, and then he can get away with even as low as 49-48% equity against the calling range once I'm being this tight. Let's say 50% equity, which lets him expand actually his range, where if we ask what has 50% equity against the shoving range, we would get sevens plus ace queen off ace jack suited. Of course, as I widen my range, if I were to add ace king offsuit in there, which is another 12 combos, you'd get this to 28. Folding would drop to 61, and then again he would need massive amounts of equity. And once I'm flatting something like ace king plus, even if we increase his post flop equity here, he would have to be quite tight, not super tight. I guess if he has 30% equity against my range, so he's not doing this with trashy hands, you get to something like 55% equity, which just to finish off would be nines plus ace queen suited ace king. Kind of a deep analysis of the pre-flop situation, but you can see how sensitive his strategy is to my response. Where if I'm responding by only calling, he can probably do this pretty wide. If I'm responding by calling too tight, it gets even wider. It's never gonna be like crazy wide, because in the end he does need to win a pot against rocket scientist. Definitely a lot wider than I would have assumed. And like we said, if I were just shoving aces and kings, actually narrower than with me having a calling range. So that being said, I'm gonna call. Take a flop, ace 5-9, he bets third pot, call, turn 3 of spades, he bets third pot, and I call, and in this situation I was already getting a bit of a funny feeling. My range has to be extremely narrow at this point. Like the amount of money that went in pre-flop, plus the third pot and the other third pot, I'm not even sure I would have worse than ace king on the river personally. Like, to have worse than ace king on the river, I'd have to either call kings or queens twice, or I'd need to call ace queen suited pre-flop and then get here with it. And then he shoved the river, and I was, you know, obviously I'm snap calling, but as far as a feeling of what to do, I had this feeling that this is going to be, again, one of these spots where people can potentially mess up really big, and something about what he did was just wrong. I think what happens here is that because of the pre-flop action and because we're so deep, by the time he puts the third bet in, he's narrowing my range so much that ace king is actually the bottom of my range, and I should in theory be folding some of my ace kings, wary of his aces, as far as how GTO would play. And that usually implies that he should have taken a smaller bet sizing scheme. In practice, bluffing here would be terrible, I think, because nobody's ever folding ace king in my shoes. Also, your value hands are not maximizing the amount of money they can make, because say he has ace king, Is he shoving hoping to get me to fold a chop? Had he made smaller bet sizes, like smaller maybe pre-flop, 20% flop, 20% turn, 20% river, put me in a tough spot with all sorts of hands. But when he does this, I think for my range, I just call ace king plus. It's very difficult for him to bluff or do anything about it. So I simmed this with kind of weird ranges. I gave him this range. I gave me this range, which is wider than I would have had in practice. But you need slightly wider ranges or PO will not have anyone ever betting. And what you see here is that if you were to go 1/3 pot flop and then 1/3 pot turn, which are not very common lines, but they are okay lines, and then we get this river, PO would sometimes shove. The shoving range would be based around aces, and my response would be kind of like I expected, to fold some of my ace kings and just call ace king and aces, making this a ridiculously tight spot, one where probably his bet sizing is optimal only if he has specifically pocket aces. And were we to get even deeper than this, or were my range to be narrower, which it certainly would have been, you get kind of in a situation like if you're infinite big blinds deep pre-flop and someone just goes all in, you can just call him with aces and that's it. And I think this was a bit that situation. So yeah, obviously I'm calling expecting to see ace kings, but I run into king queen suited. I respect every player I play against for what it's worth. Just because a hand seems not good to me doesn't mean I'm not going to check and figure out, is this maybe good? And I would say pre-flop is a lot closer than I thought when I was looking at the hand. I still think king queen suited is probably a bit too loose. According to every way I've managed to model this situation, it never gets quite to king queen suited, but it's pretty close. Post flop, I think he, like I said, Wild West spot, he made a pretty huge blunder shoving the river. It feels like, you know, I need to pick some bluff, what's wrong with this one? But actually this is one of those situations where we're so deep that no, you don't need to pick some bluff. If you're bluffing, bluff with ace king to get me off a chop. And like I said, even with these tight ranges, shoving a bluff like a hand like queens would be massively losing. Same with a hand like kings, because I just don't need to fold enough to allow these kind of bluffs. You have to have an ace and a king, and even then you're looking to make me fold ace king. That's it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it and take something away from the way I analyze this hand. These spots, they are very important if you can find some kind of generalization to play them better than the other people. These are the spots where people are going to make very, very large mistakes, as we can see here. If you liked the video, please subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.